Here are my top 10 books and series. Before we get into these, I want to say that the first 5 of these books are not in any particular order. It's really the top 5 that have what I'd say a pretty set order for their ranking. The rest of these, it's kind of hit or miss. It really depends on the mood that I'm in at the time. Coming in at number 10, it's not so much a book, but it's a play in book form that I read in college, Death of a Salesman by Arthur Miller. Something about the story of this book, of a guy struggling with his identity, what is expected of him as a man in society, really hit home with me. And this book, I've read it a handful of times since I first read it in college, and it's just always been one of my favorites since I read it. Next up is SPQR by Mary Beard. This book was my first foray into the social history of the Roman Empire. Before this, I was very political, military history, even as a... Sorry, neighbors were being a little weird outside. Sorry, not as a classics professor, but as a classics student. So this book, it really brought to life a different side of Rome that I hadn't had too much of a chance to explore in like a non-academic setting. If you are at all interested in Roman history, this is a book that you 100% should read. It gives new life to a side that isn't often talked about in popular culture. Frankenstein is a book that I read first in high school. I guess I haven't really read it since, but it stuck with me. It was very impactful at the time. A very good read, a very classic read. Yeah, Frankenstein at number 8, I think we're at right now. This next book is part of the first series that we're going to talk about. It's The Wicked Day. The Wicked Day is part of Mary Stuart's Arthurian saga. It covers the story of King Arthur, and it's really the first time that I got introduced to the story in a way outside of The Sword and the Stone by Disney. It does a wonderful job covering the Arthurian saga. Hi, Stuart. How are you? Stuart just wanted to come say hi, but he's gone now. No, this does a wonderful job covering the story of King Arthur from the perspective of Merlin. We actually start the story with Merlin and go through Merlin's life and then eventually into King Arthur. This is the final book in the series. I've reread it a couple of times, and the whole series is just a classic masterpiece. Really one that you ought to read. At number 6, we have Augustus by Adrian Goldsworthy. Augustus, he's always been one of my favorite figures from Roman history. I'm sure that goes for a number of people. And this, I have 2 biographies about him, and this is by far my favorite of the 2. It does a wonderful job, very compelling at telling the story of his life. Amazing book, amazing storytelling of the life of Augustus. Again, 100%. If you are into Roman history, need to read this. All right, now we're going to get into the top 5. These are all books that in one way or another have had an impact on my life in either my reading life or just my world perspective or where I was at the time. We're going to get into those. At number 5 is the next series in this video, the Bartimaeus Trilogy by Jonathan Stroud. This book, it was one, I remember at the time I was kind of in a reading slump, and I think for Easter, my mom got me this book, and I was kind of skeptical. I didn't really read it for a number of months, and then one day I just was like, okay, I'm going to pick it up. I picked it up, started reading it, and it is so good. It is young adult. The second book in the series kind of starts to get away from that, has one of the spookiest, scariest things that I've encountered in a book. It still sits with me to this day. I still think about it and get shivers. But this book follows a young wizard who summons a demon named Bartimaeus. Demons are the main way that people use magic and power in this world. And he uses Bartimaeus to elevate himself through the ranks of London imperial society. In the first book, together they steal this amulet. It sets off a whole chain of events. It's a really good book, a really good start to a fantastic trilogy. If you're into young adult, if you're into fantasy, you should try this book. All right, next up, we've got a real classic, David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. This book is probably one of my favorites. Well, it is one of my favorites of all time. It's at number 4. And just look how many times I have read this copy. It is literally taped together. It is falling apart. This follows basically the life of a young man named David Copperfield. It is so profound and so well tells the story basically of life and of love. It hit me at the right spot where I really got pulled in by the love stories of his life, especially the first love story. I felt for him and with him because I'd just come out of a similar circumstance. This book, again, it's great, it's beautiful, it's good. All right, for the next one here, for number 3, I don't actually have a physical copy of it, oddly enough, but it's The Chronicles of Narnia. Anyone who knows fantasy has at least heard of The Chronicles of Narnia. It is one of my top 3 and one of the best that I know of. It tells the story of a family of kids who find a magical land inside a wardrobe and all of the things that go on there. It is a deeply Christian story, which at the time when I found that out, I felt like I was the smartest kid in the world. But a deeply Christian story, a beautiful story, a well-written story, and a wonderful world, even if J.R.R. Tolkien disagreed with that. But just a great story for kids. Definitely worth reading as an adult, though. All right, sitting at number 2, this might not be a surprise to a lot of people, is Harry Potter. Harry Potter, for me, is pivotal. This series is what got me into reading. It's what made me fall in love. The way my mom tells it, I didn't really like reading. And then she kept trying books, and then suddenly she came up with this one. She actually got the 3rd one first. This is the first Harry Potter book that I read, the original one that I read. And she gave it to me. I read it, and it was amazing. I fell in love right away. Did I know what was happening? No, because I'd started in the middle of the 3rd book. But it was great. And I went back, found the first book, and just chugged straight through, even rereading this one. This series is so pivotal for so many people, and it is a true classic work of fantasy, even if it has its problems and its flaws, which it definitely does. All right, finally, at the top, this might not be a huge surprise to a lot of people, is The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. Lord of the Rings is kind of like Harry Potter for me. The way I usually tell it to people is where Harry Potter made me fall in love with reading, Tolkien made me fall in love with writing and world building. It ignited a passion for what storytelling can be that I hadn't realized before. It is such an amazing work, and the world he builds is so deep and so creative. I actually had a realization recently that, you know, a lot of booktubers, they talk about fantasy, and they talk about a lot of fantasy. But people who like Tolkien, or who are really into Tolkien, you usually only see them making Tolkien content, which to me just kind of speaks to how much there is to talk about in this. Which, granted, there's others out there. There's the Wheel of Time, and there's all of Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere, which I haven't gotten into. I've tried, and I might try again because I know people say it's good. But this series, it's one of those pinnacles of fantasy that holds up so much. Again, it's old, and as a result, it's its own set of problems that you need to come to bear with when you read it. But it is worth your time if you can get through it.